My name is Florence, and the night my apartment went up in flames was the night I finally understood how invisible I had been in my own life. It wasn't a dramatic fire like in the movies with explosions or heroic escapes. It was quiet, almost mundane at first, until the smoke thickened and the smell of melting plastic crept into the hallways. I was in my pajamas, a cotton tank top, and worn shorts, barefoot on the cold concrete sidewalk outside my building in Portland, Oregon, clutching nothing but my phone and the little backpack I'd thrown together in panic. The fire alarms had been wailing for what felt like forever, and somewhere between the blaring beeps and the smell of smoke, I had a sudden, piercing clarity. No one was going to show up for me. My parents, whom I had always assumed were the people who would rush to my side no matter what, were somewhere else entirely. I didn't even hear my little brother or sister calling me or checking if I was okay. Instead, I got texts from them, but not messages of concern or offers of help. They were screenshots, videos, memes. Someone in my family had already started documenting the fire on social media, capturing the destruction of my home like it was a curated piece of content instead of the collapse of someone's life. My heart was hammering, and I realized, in the strangest, most awful way, that I had always been a backup plan in their eyes. The invisible one who fixed problems quietly, who showed up for everyone else but never asked for anything in return. My mom had always preached about loyalty and family first. Yet, here she was, miles away, treating my tragedy as an amusing story to tell later. My father's last words to me echoed in my head, a sarcastic laugh disguised as wisdom. Well, maybe this'll teach you to manage your life better. The absurdity of the moment didn't stop my body from shaking. I realized that the little apartment I had painstakingly decorated with thrifted furniture, thrifted memories, and moments of solitude was gone. Everything, the photos, the books, the notes, this small collection of plants I'd spent years growing was now nothing but ash and smoke. And yet, while my home burned, the part of me that had spent decades untangling the chaos of my family's lives, the calendars, the bills, the hidden favors no one ever acknowledged kicked in. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even reach for my phone to post some desperate story. I just stood there, absorbing every sound, every crackle, every flicker of the flames, and thought, this is it. I've always been the safety net. And right now, no one is catching me. The fire wasn't just consuming my apartment. It was exposing the invisible threads of neglect and selfishness woven into my family dynamic. And in that instant, I made a silent promise to myself that whatever came next, I would never let my energy, my time, or my care be taken for granted again. I would survive, I would rebuild, and I would do it entirely on my own terms, without anyone's applause or interference. The morning after the fire, I found myself in a cheap motel off the highway, the kind with a sticky carpet and a faint smell of bleach that couldn't hide the lingering smoke in my hair. I didn't bother unpacking anything because there was nothing left to unpack. My bag held the essentials, a few clean clothes, my laptop, and the documents I had managed to grab from my apartment before the flames consumed everything else. The first thing I did was check my phone, half expecting a wave of calls, texts, or even frantic voicemails from my family, but all I found were notifications from strangers, friends, and coworkers offering help, sending messages like, "Hey, I heard what happened. Do you need a place to crash? And let me know if I can help with anything at all." Even people I barely knew had reached out in ways my family never had. It was an almost surreal contrast. Strangers cared, but my blood relatives, the people who had sworn countless times that family comes first, had treated the destruction of my home like entertainment. I sat on the motel bed, the cheap floral sheets rustling under me, and opened my laptop. I started with the insurance forms, then the fire department report, uploading, scanning, and filling in every field methodically. My hands shook slightly at first, but my mind, trained from years of keeping everyone else's lives organized, found its rhythm. I realized that I could control this part, even if I couldn't control the flames or the fact that my family had abandoned me. I poured coffee into the disposable cup from the lobby, black and bitter, and let the aroma anchor me while I worked. Each spreadsheet I filled out, each form I scanned and sent, was a small act of reclaiming agency. I noticed something funny as I worked. I was calmer than I had been in years. Even though my life had just burned down around me, my family had always thrived on performance and appearances, relying on me to fix the chaos they created behind closed doors. And yet, when the literal fire arrived, no one stepped in. I had become invisible in my own life, the one everyone assumed would catch every mistake, smooth every rough edge, and rescue everyone else while never asking for a single favor. That realization didn't make me angry immediately. It made me precise. Every click, every upload, every completed form became an exercise in control, a demonstration that I didn't need anyone else to survive. By midday, I had an apartment lined up in a different part of town, a small, unassuming studio where the walls were thin but mine, where I could breathe without the constant noise of someone else's drama, demanding my attention. I realized something else then. My family would always expect me to fix things, to be the invisible engine behind their curated lives, but I wasn't invisible anymore. I didn't feel bitter yet. I felt something sharper, more deliberate, a clarity that if I kept running to put out fires I hadn't started, I would never live my own life. The fire was gone, but the lesson remained. I would survive, yes, but on my own terms. My family's chaos was theirs now. My responsibility ended where my front door started. I made a quiet decision that day. The next time someone expected me to be a safety net, I would stop. And when I thought about my parents' faces, their smirks in the smoke, I understood that the real power wasn't in the fire itself, but in choosing when, how, and for whom I would show up. I had learned that lesson, and nothing would make me forget it. Moving into the new studio felt like stepping into a world that finally belonged to me. The walls were a pale cream, the floors creaked in odd places, and the windows were thin enough that I could hear traffic humming from the street below. But every inch of it was mine. I spent the first week arranging the space with the few belongings I had salvaged from the fire, mostly clothes, my laptop, and a handful of books I had managed to rescue. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh paint and floor polish, and it felt almost ceremonial, a physical declaration that I was reclaiming my life from the ashes. I opened my laptop and pulled up my old family balance spreadsheet, the one I had started years ago to track every favor, every loan, every unpaid bill I had quietly managed for them. Seeing the endless rows of numbers, dates, and tasks reminded me of every time I had sacrificed my evenings, weekends, and sometimes even sleep to make sure my family's lives appeared smooth while their chaos simmered just beneath the surface. Each entry was a silent testament to my endurance and the countless ways I had been used without acknowledgement. I realized that for all my family's talk about loyalty, love, and togetherness, they had never once asked how I was doing, how I had survived the fire, or if I needed a bed to sleep in. Instead, they had taken my life apart like a reality show, documenting it for laughs, likes, and shares. That recognition didn't make me bitter so much as resolute. I decided that this new chapter required boundaries, clear and unyielding. I would no longer be the invisible engine of their lives. The spreadsheets became more than just records. They became a map of where I had been and a guide to where I could go. I created a new section called Exit Plan, and every line I typed felt like a quiet reclamation of power. Step 1. Identify all accounts, logins, and subscriptions I managed for them. Step 2. Prepare instructions so they could take over without relying on me. Step 3. Enforce my boundaries by refusing further loans or favors. Step 4. Document everything and walk away, not angrily, but decisively. I knew that once I executed this plan, the dynamic I had tolerated for so long, being everyone's fixer, accountant, and scapegoat would end. That didn't mean I didn't care about them. It meant I cared about myself enough to stop being treated as disposable. For the first time, I understood that self-preservation wasn't selfish. It was necessary. My mornings became routines of order. Coffee, emails, insurance updates, and slowly rebuilding my personal finances. I even made time for things I had neglected for years, like running along the river, buying groceries without calculating how it affected someone else's budget, and spending quiet evenings reading in my tiny living room undisturbed. I began to notice small things that had been invisible when I was consumed with managing everyone else's chaos, the sunlight through the curtains, the smell of rain on the streets, the subtle hum of the city at night. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was observing, noticing, and reclaiming the simple pleasures of life that had been drowned out by obligation. And yet, even as I enjoyed this newfound peace, I knew that the real challenge would be maintaining it. My family would notice my absence and they would react. They would call, text, or guilt me into stepping back into the role I had painstakingly abandoned. But for the first time, I felt ready to face their attempts without faltering. I was no longer just the girl who kept everyone else afloat. I was Florence, and I was finally floating for myself. The fire had burned my apartment, yes, but it had ignited something else. The understanding that I could rebuild not just a home, but a life where I was the priority. And that realization was stronger than any flame they could throw in my path. It didn't take long for the ripple effects of my absence to reach my family. The first messages came slowly, small nudges at first. My dad forwarding an email from his accountant with the subject line, "Urgent, missing documentation." My mom sending me a text about a confusing medical bill she couldn't decipher. Sophie tagging me in a spreadsheet she couldn't balance. At first, I felt a flicker of old instinct, the urge to jump in and fix it all. But I stopped myself, letting my finger hover over the keyboard before typing. This time, the responsibility wasn't mine. I realized that every panic-filled message they sent, every reminder of tasks they had relied on me to manage, was a reflection of a life they had outsourced to me for years. I had been the invisible scaffolding, holding up their carefully curated versions of success. And now that scaffolding was gone. It was an odd mix of satisfaction and discomfort to watch them flail, to see the consequences of relying on someone else to always catch the mistakes. My dad in particular struggled visibly. The messages escalated from passive requests to tense accusations. "I can't believe you're doing this now," he wrote one afternoon, almost pleading as if my withdrawal was a sudden betrayal. "I've never asked for anything unreasonable," my mother added in another message, her usual calm and controlled tone giving way to a sharp edge. Sophie, on the other hand, oscillated between frantic messages and emotional appeals. "I don't know what to do without you," she texted one night. "You always know exactly how to make everything work. Can't you just help me one more time?" I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and irritation reading her words. For years, I had done these tasks silently, without acknowledgement, without thanks, because I loved them, because I wanted their lives to run smoothly. But in that love, my boundaries had been trampled. Their reliance had become entitlement, and entitlement had turned into a toxic expectation that my labor was part of the family package. I realized that stepping back was not cruelty. It was survival, a necessary assertion of self-worth that I had neglected for too long. I began responding differently. To my father, I sent a simple, methodical email. "Everything you need is organized and accessible. You will need to manage these documents or hire someone to help you." My mother received a step-by-step guide to navigate her insurance, portals with passwords reset and instructions attached, and Sophie got a detailed, fully annotated version of her wedding spreadsheet with all deadlines and payments marked, followed by a note that said simply, "You have the information. You will need to manage it yourself from here." I didn't sugarcoat anything. I didn't plead or justify. I documented everything carefully, as I always had. But this time, I refused to be the safety net. Watching their initial panic unfold was almost mesmerizing. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt empowered. The fire had taken my home, yes, but it had also revealed something crucial. I was not cursed. I was capable, and I could exist independently of the chaos they relied on me to manage. I went to bed that night knowing that the quiet discomfort my family felt was the natural consequence of their years of entitlement. They could call me, text me, even plead, but nothing would compel me to step back into the role I had chosen to abandon. And for the first time, I felt the weight on my own shoulders lift not from lack of responsibility, but from finally reclaiming the life that was always mine to live. As the weeks passed, the reality of my decision settled into both my life and theirs. My family's messages, which had started as urgent pleas and confused questions, gradually shifted to a mix of irritation and disbelief. My father, who had always prided himself in control, sent a flurry of emails that grew increasingly frustrated. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he wrote one morning. "We've always counted on you. Don't abandon the family now." I read the email, fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment, before calmly typing, "I am not abandoning anyone. I am simply stepping back from responsibilities that have never been mine to carry." I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I didn't justify. The power of my words lay in their finality. My mother's approach was more insidious, more emotionally charged. She called me multiple times a week, often at inconvenient hours, using guilt as a weapon. "Florence, I just need a little help," she would say softly, her voice dripping with vulnerability she had carefully curated to manipulate. "I can't do this on my own. You're the only one who really understands." I listened quietly, feeling the old tug of instinct, the part of me that had always rushed in to fix everything, but this time I stayed firm. "You can," I said evenly. "You've had the resources and knowledge all along. It's your responsibility now." The line went silent, the weight of her realization hanging between us. Sophie's reaction was perhaps the most visceral. Wedding planning had been her domain of control, but in reality, I had been the one quietly keeping the numbers in check. Now, she flailed in a way that was almost theatrical, sending screenshots of unpaid deposits, conflicting vendor emails, and budget discrepancies. Each message reminded me of years of unseen labor, of nights spent untangling her chaos while being told it was cute, but confusing or could. "You just fix this?" I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction in knowing that, for once, she had to navigate the consequences herself. Even Evan, my younger brother, who'd once treated me like a personal bank and crisis manager, struggled. Inventory spreadsheets went unbalanced. Crypto calculations faltered, and he began to feel the pressure of deadlines without my steady hand smoothing the edges. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very people who had treated my presence as a given were suddenly forced to confront the reality that their lives depended on effort, diligence, and responsibility qualities I had always quietly provided. In the midst of all this, I began to notice a shift in myself. The anxiety I had carried for years, an invisible, unspoken burden of keeping everyone else's lives afloat, began to lift. I slept better, I focused better, I laughed more freely. Simple things like grocery shopping, organizing my own finances, and planning my weekends without interference became acts of liberation. I started logging my own life into my balance sheet, a new section dedicated to Florence, therapy sessions, bills, personal projects, social outings, even moments of quiet reflection. The ledger, once a tool of exhaustion and invisible labor, became a record of agency and self-care. I began to see the beauty in boundaries, the quiet power in saying no, the profound relief of recognizing that my care and attention were not obligations to be exploited, but choices I could make for myself. And for the first time in years, I felt like the main character in my own life, not a supporting actor in someone else's carefully curated story. By the time the second month after the fire rolled around, the consequences of my absence were becoming undeniable for my family. My father, who had always been meticulous in projecting control, began missing deadlines he used to hand off to me without a second thought. Licensing, renewals, tax filings, client invoices, every task I had silently managed for years now landed squarely on his shoulders. I received the occasional frantic email, the subject line screaming urgency, and I noticed a subtle shift in tone. The bravado and certainty he always carried were replaced with a nervous hesitation. That was almost unfamiliar. My mother, who had once curated a social media presence that showed effortless family harmony, started posting less frequently. Her captions tinged with vague complaints about stress, health issues, and the chaos of adult life. I couldn't help but notice that the fire that had once consumed my apartment was now mirrored metaphorically in her life. Sophie's wedding, which she had meticulously planned to appear flawless online, began to unravel in small but significant ways. Payments were missed, vendor confirmations went unanswered, and the tight schedule she had relied on my oversight to maintain fell apart. I received screenshots of emails piling up in her inbox, along with frantic texts. "I can't handle this alone." For years, I had been the quiet administrator, the person who kept the numbers straight, the deadlines on track, the chaos contained. Now, watching her scramble, I realized that the perfection she projected was never truly hers. It was the invisible labor I had provided. Evan, too, felt the impact. His small ventures and side hustles, previously cushioned by my assistance, began showing cracks. Loans I had tracked were late, restocks went uncalculated, and the carefully maintained veneer of his financial independence started to wobble. The irony was sharp and undeniable. The same family who had laughed at the destruction of my home was now experiencing the consequences of a life that had depended on me without acknowledgement. But while I observed their struggles, I noticed something within myself shift even more profoundly. I no longer felt guilty for stepping back. The weight that had constantly pressed on my shoulders, the need to fix everything, to prevent every minor disaster, to silently absorb every mistake was lifting. I was finally free to live on my own terms, to make decisions that prioritized my well-being instead of their convenience. Simple, daily routines, once interrupted by crisis calls, now flowed uninterrupted. Grocery shopping became a mindful experience. My evenings were mine alone, and I allowed myself to invest time in projects and hobbies I had ignored for years. I even started journaling in a new section of my balance sheet, logging personal milestones, small victories, and moments of growth. For the first time, the ledger, once a symbol of my invisible labor, had become a reflection of my autonomy, a tangible record of what it meant to prioritize myself. And while my family struggled, I felt neither satisfaction nor vindictiveness. I simply recognized the balance had shifted. The fire had been devastating, yes, but it had also illuminated the truth. I was not cursed. I was capable, resilient, and deserving of respect. My choice to step back was not a punishment, it was self-preservation. Watching them navigate life without me was a quiet affirmation that I had finally broken free of the invisible chains that had bound me to their chaos for too long. For the first time, I felt a profound sense of peace, tempered with clarity. I could survive, thrive, and live fully, independent of the expectations that had once defined my existence. As the months rolled on, the reality of my absence began to crystallize in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. My family's attempts to regain control over the aspects of life they had long relied on me to manage became more frequent, more desperate, and at times almost absurd. My father, who had always been the embodiment of pragmatism, now called almost daily, fumbling through conversations he had once passed along with a shrug, as if expecting me to step back into the same old role. "Florence, can you just walk me through this?" he would ask, voice tense, a subtle undertone of frustration peeking through, and I would simply reply, calmly, "You have the information. You will need to manage it yourself or hire someone who can." It was precise, deliberate, and utterly final. My mother, on the other hand, tried emotional manipulation, the kind she had perfected over years of careful parenting. Her calls would begin softly, almost apologetically, laced with hints of nostalgia and guilt. "I just need a little help. You always know how to make it work." But I stayed firm. Each conversation became a test of my resolve, and each time I held my ground, I felt a little lighter, a little more certain of my autonomy. Sophie's responses were a mixture of panic and incredulity. Wedding logistics that had previously been invisible to her now loomed large, and she bombarded me with messages filled with questions, often punctuated with emotional pleas. "I can't figure this out alone. Florence, you're the only one who understands." I read the messages and reminded myself that the understanding I had given freely for years was not an obligation. I forwarded her spreadsheets with annotations for clarity and then stepped back, refusing to reinsert myself into a system I had voluntarily exited. Evan's crises were more material than emotional. Inventory errors, mismanaged crypto trades, overdue payment, saw the chaos he had outsourced to me now, demanded his attention. He texted frantically, trying to charm, cajole, or guilt me into stepping back in. But I had learned the limits of my responsibility. I didn't answer at first. Then I sent one succinct message, listing everything he owed me and stating clearly that I would no longer provide financial support or management. Silence. A week later, a terse, frustrated text, "You're being unreasonable." I smiled privately at the irony. For years, I had been the unreasonable one for always letting them rely on me without complaint, without acknowledgement, without boundaries. But now I had set the rules of engagement, and the discomfort they felt was neither cruel nor unfair. It was the natural consequence of their reliance on someone who would no longer exist to catch every mistake. In the quiet of my apartment, I felt an unfamiliar sense of liberation. My routines were uninterrupted, my time was my own, and the anxiety that had always accompanied the endless balancing act of my family's lives had vanished. I began to track my own progress in a new section of my balance sheet, logging therapy sessions, creative projects, personal achievements, and even moments of solitude without guilt. The ledger, once a record of invisible labor, had become a mirror reflecting autonomy, empowerment, and self-respect. Watching my family flounder without me wasn't satisfying or vindictive. It was illuminating. The fire had taught me a harsh lesson about who they were, but stepping back had shown me who I was. I realized I could survive independently, thrive without guilt, and live fully on my own terms. I had been the invisible backbone of their lives, and now, for the first time, I was the main character in mine. And that shift, that quiet, deliberate reclaiming of my life, felt more like victory than any argument, apology, or confrontation ever could. By the time the next season arrived, I had fully settled into a life that belonged entirely to me, and the contrast with my family's reality became increasingly stark. My apartment felt like a sanctuary, a small but vivid expression of independence, where every corner reflected choices I had made for myself rather than dictated by others. I had reestablished routines that were peaceful rather than reactive. Mornings with coffee on the balcony, afternoons with errands that didn't include anyone else's chaos, evenings spent reading, journaling, or running along the riverside. I tracked my own life in the ledger I had renamed simply Balance, with categories that honored my growth, health, finances, and mental clarity. Meanwhile, the messages from my family began to slow, the initial panic giving way to a grudging realization that I would not intervene again. My father called less often, his emails now tinged with a reluctant acknowledgement that he needed to handle his own responsibilities. My mother tried a few more manipulations, veiled as gentle inquiries about appointments or bills. But I responded with measured instructions or documentation, never stepping beyond the boundary I had drawn. Sophie, facing the realities of her wedding alone, began to adapt slowly. The carefully constructed Pinterest perfect event became more authentic, simpler, and surprisingly warm, even if she never admitted that my absence had forced her to take control. Evan's financial floundering eventually led him to engage with professional help he had resisted for years. A development that I quietly noted in my ledger, aware that the life lessons he had avoided were now unavoidable. Observing these changes, I realized that the fire had not only destroyed a physical space, but had also ignited a transformation that extended far beyond me. I was no longer the invisible scaffolding holding their lives together. I had created distance, yes, but that distance was not bitterness. It was clarity, agency, and self-preservation. I began to embrace a profound sense of freedom, a liberation that came from understanding that my labor, attention, and care were no longer obligations to be exploited, but gifts I could choose to give, selectively and intentionally. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet power of boundaries, the subtle strength in letting others face the consequences of their choices. And as I built a life filled with personal accomplishments and peace, I noticed something remarkable. The world didn't collapse without me. The chaos my family had quietly depended upon me to manage didn't vanish entirely, but it became theirs to navigate. They would stumble, adapt, and hopefully learn. I didn't have to control the outcome. And in that relinquishing of responsibility, I discovered joy. My friends, coworkers, and new connections became my chosen family. Those who offered support without expectation, who celebrated successes without tallying them as debts owed. I reveled in quiet nights without interruptions, in routines I had chosen, in the unspoken dignity of living without someone else's drama, constantly pulling me backward. The fire, once a symbol of devastation and betrayal, had become a catalyst for transformation. I was no longer the cursed one, the invisible pillar, the fixer everyone assumed would exist endlessly in the background. I was Florence, fully present in her own life, and every boundary I maintained reinforced that truth. It was a subtle, powerful form of triumph, not public, not performative, but undeniably mine. The ledger now told a story I had written for myself, one of survival, autonomy, and quiet, steady empowerment that no one could take away. As the year drew to a close, I finally felt the weight of the past lift in a way I had never imagined possible. My apartment, modest and quietly lived in, had become more than a home. It was a symbol of agency, of a life reconstructed from the ashes of neglect and entitlement. Each morning, as sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors and I brewed my coffee, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The fire that had once devastated my world had revealed the stark truth about my family. They were incapable of seeing my value until I withdrew it. And yet, this was not a story of vengeance. It was a story of reclamation, of learning that my presence, labor, and care were not obligations, and that boundaries were acts of self-respect, not cruelty. I continued to track my life in my balance ledger, now filled with accomplishments, milestones, and personal growth. Therapy sessions, running progress, savings goals, quiet dinners with friends, and even small indulgences. Each entry was a testament to choices made freely, without pressure or expectation. My family's absence from my life, once a source of resentment, had become a canvas on which I could build a life that truly reflected my priorities. Occasionally, I would check their social media or receive updates indirectly, and I noticed the subtle changes that my absence had forced. My father was learning, albeit slowly, to manage his own finances and deadlines. My mother, less polished online, had begun to confront her responsibilities more directly, even if grudgingly. Sophie's wedding, though different from the Pinterest perfect vision she once clung to, unfolded with authenticity, intimacy, and genuine connection. Evan faced the consequences of his previous financial recklessness and started engaging with systems of accountability he had ignored for years. These changes weren't caused by me, but by my decision to step back, to refuse the role of perpetual caretaker, In the quiet of my apartment, I realized that the true lesson of the fire wasn't destruction, it was perspective. I had been the invisible fulcrum, the backbone, the quiet engine of a family that assumed my labor was limitless. When I finally withdrew it, I didn't destroy them. I gave them the opportunity to stand on their own, to experience accountability, and to face the reality of their choices. For me, it was liberation. I was no longer defined by their chaos or by the roles they had imposed. I could laugh without guilt, plan without interference, and live without the constant pressure of managing lives that were not my own. The anger I had once carried toward my family transformed into clarity, then into peace, and eventually into quiet compassion tempered with firm boundaries. I didn't need them to acknowledge the fire, the pain, or the years of invisible labor they would eventually learn on their own, if they chose to. My life had shifted from reaction to creation, from obligation to choice. And in that shift, I discovered the ultimate truth. Self-respect, autonomy, and boundaries are more powerful than any fire, any betrayal, or any expectation imposed by blood. I was no longer Florence the Invisible, the fixer, or the scapegoat. I was Florence, fully present, fully alive, and finally free. And as I closed my laptop that evening, watching the sun set over the city, I realized that the most profound fire I had ever experienced had been the one that taught me to burn away what wasn't mine to carry, leaving only what truly belonged to me. In that moment, I understood. Surviving the fire had not just rebuilt a home, it had rebuilt a life, entirely my own.